president's looking to restore America's leadership role on the world stage, Anne-Marie, by laying out a massive new investment in the fight against the coronavirus pandemic. The president will officially announce the effort today. Over the next year, the U.S. plans to donate 500 million Pfizer vaccine doses to the African Union and low and middle income countries. Now, this comes as the president is set to meet with G7 leaders tomorrow in his first overseas trip since taking office. Also, on the president's itinerary is a highly anticipated meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. That is happening next week. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki spoke to CBS this morning earlier about the administration's hopes for how discussions between the two leaders will go.
It's going to be a straightforward conversation. The president's going to raise areas where he has concern, whether it's the ransomware attacks or the aggression on the border of Ukraine or human rights abuses. But there are also areas we think we can work together. Nuclear stability. We signed an extension of New START. Russia is an important partner as it relates to the Iran nuclear deal where negotiations are ongoing. So we want to move to a more stable and predictable relationship. That's in our interest. We don't want it to be adversarial and always heightened.
All right, let's bring in Nancy Cordes. She is in Cornwall, England, for the latest on all of this. So, Nancy, good to see you. With this new commitment to purchase 500 million vaccine doses for worldwide distribution, the United States is set to be the global COVAX Alliance's largest vaccine donor. Why was this move a priority for the Biden administration?
Well, I think that they wanted to make a splash on arrival here in the UK and send the message that the U.S. is back diplomatically on the world stage, that President Biden wants to work not only with the world leaders who he's going to be meeting with here in Cornwall, but with other allies as well. And yes, there have been other deals that have been announced before this, but the White House is really touting the fact that this will be the largest donation of vaccines from a single country ever. It is meant to send a message that the U.S. wants to be the global leader when it comes to fighting COVID. And it's also meant to kick off a conversation here at the G7 summit about how these major nations can work together to fight COVID, because obviously, you can run up the vaccination rate in the U.S. or here in the U.K. or anywhere else. But if it remains as low as it is in the rest of the world, then we're never fully going to rid ourselves of this very dangerous virus.
So meanwhile, the G7 summit begins tomorrow. We know that President Biden's going to be taking a different approach than his predecessors, but I'm really curious about what they'll be talking about and the strategy that the president will take. Obviously, he's not Donald Trump. This is not the America First approach to foreign relations, but I think if there's anything that world leaders learned, they probably already knew this, but they learned that a lot can change with an American election now, that things can go into a complete reversal with just one election. And I'm sure the president is going to be speaking to leaders and trying to sort of reassure them that America is a stable place.
Right, and he's already been welcomed very warmly onto the world stage by a number of the leaders who he'll be meeting with here, which is a major change from G7 summits from the past 4 years that often boiled over and became very contentious. There's that one famous photo of Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, with her hands planted on a desk, basically leaning over and glaring at President Trump as he was scowling back because they had a major disagreement over an agreement that all the leaders were going to sign. So, there was a very unpredictable, wild ride for these world leaders, and they have expressed the fact that they're very relieved that their relationship with the United States is becoming more predictable. And that is a message that this White House is looking to send as well, that the U.S. itself wants to reset its relationships with these allies. And then they're going to get down to business. They're going to talk about coronavirus. They're going to talk about the possibility of a global 15% tax on profitable corporations. They're going to talk about Afghanistan and retaining a diplomatic presence there. They're going to talk about infrastructure in the developing world. There are a lot of interests that these countries share that go well beyond fighting the pandemic that everyone's been fixated on, and rightly so, for the past year and a half.
I will never forget that photo, Nancy. It is sort of going to go down in history as iconic. I really honestly believe that. It'll be right up there with that photo of FDR, Stalin, and Churchill at Yalta. So let's talk about the president meeting with British Prime Minister Boris Johnson in Cornwall today. Tell us more about their dynamic and what they'll be discussing.
Right. So that's going to be a really interesting meeting to watch. You know, Boris Johnson, he is conservative. And when President Trump was first elected, the two of them seemed to sort of share a bond and common cause, and they were pretty chummy. In fact, a lot of people found a lot of similarities between the two of them, both in their politics and in their personal style. But that relationship, like so many other relationships that President had on the world stage, kind of fell apart. And towards the end, Prime Minister Johnson was openly critical of President Trump and really hailed the arrival of President Biden, and has gone out of his way to congratulate President Biden for example, rejoining the Paris Climate Accords. So they're going to talk about climate. They are going to talk about transatlantic air travel today. That's a big issue. You know, UK residents who want to go to the U.S. are still, by and large, barred from doing so due to COVID. And even U.S. residents traveling here to the U.K. have to quarantine for at least 5 days, up to 10 days when they get here. And that's obviously an arrangement nobody likes. It was necessitated by the pandemic, but the two leaders are going to be talking about ways that they might be able to ease those restrictions in the future. They'll also be discussing some issues that they don't see eye to eye on. For instance, Brexit and trade and the UK relationship with Northern Ireland. These are areas where their differences are well established, but they are going to be talking about those topics today, and we'll hear a little bit more about how all that went when President Biden makes remarks to the press following the meeting a little later.
Switching gears. Sorry, let me let you get that question, Anne-Marie.
All right, I will say switching gears a little bit. I just want to focus on some domestic stuff because when the president left, you know, he left a lot of loose ends back here at home, things that he had hoped to sort of wrap up that didn't happen. Chief among them, some sort of bipartisan infrastructure deal. He walked away from the negotiations with Republican senators earlier this week. What does the White House see then as the path forward?
Right, kind of an abrupt end to those conversations, which had been quite cordial, but the White House clearly deciding that there was not going to be space for an agreement at the end of the day. And with the Republican Senator Shelley Moore Capito, who had been the chief negotiator with President Biden, saying that she felt that the goalposts had been moved by the White House. So clearly they're going to agree to disagree. And now the White House is really turning its attention to this bipartisan group of senators who have also been working this entire time to try to craft an alternative infrastructure proposal that might be palatable to both sides. You know, sometimes it can be a little easier for your opponent to swallow a piece of legislation when it's coming from fellow lawmakers rather than from a White House that is run by the opposite party. So those talks are ongoing. The White House says it's paying very keen attention to how those talks play out. They're obviously in communication with the Democrats who are on that team of senators, and we'll see where that takes us. This is a bipartisan group that has often gets close to the finish line, sometimes gets over it, but often their work gets rejected, particularly by Republicans. So we're going to be watching to see whether they can have more success this time, because if that doesn't pan out, then the White House moves to Plan C, which is to try to go it alone solely with Democrats.
All right, Nancy Cordes, thank you so much.
You're welcome.